Hello and welcome to my home studio, such as it is. I want to present a ballad for you today, an old traditional ballad associated with Halloween. It's The Wife of Usher's Well, one of the oldest of the child ballads, named after Francis Child, the antiquarian who collected them in the 19th century. That's ballad number 79 in his collection. The Wife of Usher's Well is about a woman who has three sons and sends them off to school in some versions of the ballad, but sends them away, and they have a shipwreck at sea and they are all lost. And she goes mad with or at least enraged at the news, and she casts a terrible curse on the winds and the waters that have taken them down. And whether or not that affects the winds and the waters, it certainly affects the sons, who do in fact return from the afterlife for a single night. But of course, they can't stay. And that's the basic plot of The Wife of Usher's Well. And I want to explain some of the terminology, because there's some dialect terms here we need to know, and some of the associations that we may miss from a mere performance of the ballad. And after this analysis, then I'm also going to perform the ballad set to a new tune. The Wife of Usher's Well is probably a widow, because her husband is never mentioned. She's a wealthy woman, that is mentioned. She owns a farm and she has maidens in her employ. She may have other people outside the house, farmhands and so forth. And she might even have other businesses. Probably inherited them from her husband, but she's running the show. She's in charge. And she is referred to several times as a Carlin wife. Carline or Carlin is the feminine form of the Germanic Karl, which is the name Charles in other Germanic languages. English palatalizes everything. And Karl was a status word originally. It referred to the middle sort of folk between aristocrats and slaves. In Old Norse society, there were three social classes named after three mythological brothers, Jarl, Karl, and Thrall. And the Jarls were the nobles, that's cognate with English earl. And the Thralls were slaves. And we still talk about thraldom, slavery or bondage. And the Karls were the people who farmed their own farms, sailed their own boats to fish, might be merchants, other kinds of things. They could be poor, they could be wealthy, but they were the mass of the population, the free inhabitants of the North. And so Karl, feminine Carline. In later Norse days, the term Karl fell out of fashion. And in Old Norse, the favored term for this status group would have been bondur. And a bonder was a person who was a free peasant. And if he was the head of his own household, he would be a husbonder, which is the source of our term husband. The term Karl fell out in Northern dialect and was replaced by Carling. In Southern dialect, in what we call Old English, the term was chorl, and it was a neutral term. It simply referred to the free peasants, so the yeomen, as we would later call them, of the land. And of course, after the Norman conquest, all the English of all classes lost status against the Normans. And the term in Middle English became churl. And to be churlish meant you were ill-mannered. You were socially low. You didn't know how to act among the gentry, among the gentlefolk. And of course, let's be honest, the Norman aristocrats were a bunch of bloodthirsty, illiterate savages, most of them, whose manners didn't have a whole lot to recommend them, but they had a particular code they lived by, and all the English didn't know that code and were kept out of that code. And so they were churlish, and eventually churl came to mean loutish, oafish, stupid, ill-favored, grumpy, and uncooperative, and all those other things. That didn't happen in the North, where the feminine form Carline continued for a long time. And it referred to an independent woman, a woman who ran her own affairs, like this widow, the wife of Usher as well. In time, however, it also acquired a kind of pejorative meaning. It came to mean old woman, hag, or witch. And of course, if you think of an old woman living alone, she might be in poverty or she might not. Particularly an old woman with no one to support her living in a hut. People might think she's a witch, but she's in fact not a serf or a slave. She's a free woman. She's just poor and old and left alone. And the ambiguity between the meaning of a middle-class free woman, like the wealthy wife of Usher as well, and a woman who can throw a powerful curse, which the wife of Usher as well certainly does, overlaps here. And I think that ambiguity is meant in referring to the wife of Usher as well as a Carlin wife. Well, as I mentioned, her three sons are drowned at sea, and her grief causes her to curse the wind and the water. She says, "I wish the wind may never cease, nor fashes in the flood, till my three sons come hame to me in earthly flesh and blood." Well, of course, that can't happen. And yet a mother's blessing or a mother's curse was considered a very powerful thing. There's another old Scots ballad from the Glasgow region called The Mother's Malison, in which a young man is going off to visit his sweetheart, of which his mother does not approve and does not want him to go to sea. And when he fully intends to go anyway, she hurls a curse after him, asking the River Clyde, to stop him in his course, and he falls into the River Clyde and drowns. So the old woman's curse or spell, the wife of Usher's well, her words have an effect, and her three sons do in fact come home from the afterlife. But they don't come home living, although you can touch them. They come home as revenants for a single night at Martinmas. And this is important to grasp for the meaning of the poem. The feast of St. Martin is November 11th. St. Martin of Tours was a Roman soldier of the 4th century, and he's the patron saint of the military and things like that, which has nothing to do with why his feast day became so popular. It became a big deal because it was a social occasion. November 11th was the beginning of the slaughtering season, when you began to cull your herds to get ready for winter. If you weren't going to feed your animals over the winter, you had to start butchering them and making sausage and smoking the meat and other things like that. And so the beginning of the preparation for Yuletide, for deep winter, begins in mid-November. And so Martinmas became part of that, that beginning of winter, that first hint of winter. Also, at the beginning of the Middle Ages, it was the beginning of Advent. And Advent is the season of preparation for Christmas. It's a penitential season in which we express our longing for the resurrection, for the life of all things to be restored. And we look forward to Doomsday, hopefully with a good attitude, not a fearful one. But nevertheless, it's an interesting set of feelings. And when everyone else is singing jolly Christmas carols, those of us who are serious Christians are all singing about our longing to be released from death. Anyway, later on, that was deemed to be too much of a season, and Advent was shortened to 4 weeks, beginning with St. Andrew's Day on November 30th. But St. Martin's Day kept this kind of association with the afterlife, with looking forward to deliverance and so forth. And then another thing happened to St. Martin's Day. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII issued a correction to the Julian calendar, which had gotten out of sync with the solar year by 10 days. And he decreed that the day after Thursday, October 4th, 1582, would be Friday, October 15th, 1582. The Pope was the only person with the international standing to have pulled off this thing that everyone knew needed to be done. But of course, since he was the Pope, and this is after the Reformation, the Protestant countries like England resisted making that change for quite some time. In fact, England and Scotland did not adopt what they call the New Style until September 1752. This is why George Washington has 2 birthdays, and you learn about that in school. And of course, the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox churches in Europe, which had split off from Catholicism in 1054, also didn't get around to adopting the Gregorian reform, for another couple of hundred years. But nevertheless, this was a big deal, and people were highly sensitive to it, and the Catholics all thought that the Pope had taken away 11 days or 10 days from their lifespan, and they were just boggled by this. Now, of course, he just renumbered the days. He didn't take any of their lifespan away. But people remembered the change far more deeply than we remember the switch over from daylight savings time. And so each year, as the new November 11th rolled around, people remembered that that used to be, and in some sense still was, November 1st, which was All Saints' Day, the commemoration of those who are safely in heaven, followed by November 2nd, All Souls' Day, the commemoration of all the faithful departed. And of course, the evening before All Saints' Day is Halloween, All Hallows' Eve. And so the new Martinmas became known as Old Halloween or Old Hallowmas. And Halloween got its reputation, and the reason that All Saints' Day was placed athwart it by the Christian church is because in the old pagan calendar, particularly the old Celtic calendar, the last night of October is Samhain, one of the great quarter days, when the barriers between the worlds are low and there can be traffic of spirits back and forth. And so on All Hallows' Eve, the dead walk, spirits are abroad, the devil's up to mischief. And Christians were taught to treat that day not only with solemnity, but with a little bit of fear. And so it is no coincidence that the wife of Usher Well's 3 sons come home on Martinmas, which is Old Halloween, when nights are long and murk. And they come home wearing birch hats, birch bark hats. And this was an ancient folk belief that the birch was a numinous plant which would protect the dead from the influence of the living. And so we're told this explicitly, that the birk did not grow in any earthly syke or ditch. Syke is a drainage ditch, but at the gates of paradise, that birk grew well enough. It also didn't grow in any shuk, which is a boundary ditch. Syke, ditch, shuk are all kind of synonymous, but that birk is from the other world, and they're wearing hats of it because they're not from this world. They belong over there somewhere. And we don't know if that's really heaven or if it's purgatory, and they haven't gone through the gates of paradise yet. But they've borrowed the birch hats and they've snuck out of the afterlife to come home to give their mother one more night with them. And their mother, oh my goodness, their mother just thinks they've come home for good. And she calls all her maidens to build up the fire and bring in water, and they're going to have a feast because all my sons are well. And of course, there's no such thing, they're dead. And she makes a big bed for them, and she tucks them all in like they were little boys, and she gathers her mantle about herself, and she falls asleep watching over them lovingly. And lying there in the bed, the 3 brothers talk amongst themselves about what they have to do, because it's getting late and the first rooster is crowing. The cock doth crow, the day doth dawn. It's time we left, the oldest says to the youngest. And the youngest says, yes, the channer and warren doth chide, bin we be missed from out our place, a sair pain we mun bide. And this is another dialect word, the channer and worm. These are not the worms that would eat you in the grave, that someone has died and worms eat him. The 3 sons are lost at sea. They don't have a grave. This is a different kind of worm. This is a worm that is gnawing on the roots of everything. And maybe in far, far, far back, there's a distant folk memory of Old Norse belief in Nidhogg, the serpent that gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree. And when he gnaws all the way through, the tree will fall and we'll have Ragnarok or Doomsday. I don't think the people who wrote the Wife of Usher's Well knew that story, but there is this sense in which that concept of a worm that eats away, a serpent that eats away at the foundations of things, that eats away time and the world's effects, is a real thing to be considered. And in a sense, there's an order to things that the three sons have outraged by coming back. Life only goes in one direction and it goes downhill. You're born and then you live and then you die and you go to the afterlife and you have to stay there and endure your fate, and you don't get to come back for seconds. But that is exactly what the three sons have done. They have snuck out of heaven or purgatory or whatever. They are absent without leave. And the worm that eats away at the order of things, that says time can only go in one direction, is outraged by this. Chanaran means grumbling, complaining. The serpent is disgusted at this. It's not a funny expression, but it sort of reminds me of Mammy in Gone with the Wind, when Scarlett O'Hara has said and done yet one more outrageous thing, and as she walks off, Mammy looks after her and says, "Tain't fittin', tain't fittin', tain't fittin'." Well, there's a sense in which the order of things thinks that what the sons have done is not fitting, and they've got to get back. The day's coming, and they can't postpone it any longer. And so the youngest says, "We've got to go," and the oldest says, "Lie still just a little longer, because if we're gone when mother wakes up, she'll go mad again." Well, whether or not she does is not in their control, and they have to leave. And of course, this is the way of things. She wouldn't be the first one who said, "Oh, if I only had one more day, if I only had one more night, if I only had one more hour, if I only had one more kiss, if I only had one more conversation. Oh, if I could only have one more of whatever, then I wouldn't hurt so much at the loss of my loved ones." But in fact, if you could have that, it would just hurt that much all over again when they have to go. And they have to go. You can't hold on to things. And the Wife of Usher's Well has got to deal with that as best they can. So the three brothers make ready to depart, and as they leave, the youngest bids farewell to his mother and to the farm, and interestingly, to the bonny lass that kindles me mother's fire, which gives you a sense that there are more stories that could have been told here if we'd had the time. And there are probably more people mourning the loss of the sons than just their mother. Well, that's the analysis of the Wife of Usher's Well. In the next part, I'm going to give you the performance of the ballad itself.